The humidity inside the Oakland dojo on that 1964 afternoon was a physical presence, a thick, stagnant layer of air that seemed to cling to the skin. It was the kind of heat that made the heavy cotton uniforms of the practitioners feel like lead weights against their shoulders. The room was a sanctuary of old-world discipline, a rectangular space of polished hardwood and whitewashed walls that echoed with the rhythmic, percussive sounds of traditional karate. 40 men moved in absolute synchronization, their bare feet slapping against the floor with a sound like wet leather. They were practicing the heian katas, pre-arranged sequences of movements that had been passed down through generations. To these men, the kata was not just an exercise, it was a religious text written in motion. Every punch had a beginning, a middle, and a definitive end. Every block was a rigid wall of bone and muscle designed to shatter an incoming limb. In the center of the room stood Sensei Hiroshi. He was a man built like a siege engine, with a neck as thick as a human thigh, and knuckles that had been pounded against makiwara, striking posts, until they were covered in a permanent layer of dark, leathery callus. He didn't speak often. He didn't need to. His presence was the gravity that held the room together. His students practiced kaimi, the art of total physical tension at the moment of impact. They believed that the harder the muscle, the more devastating the strike. The interruption came without warning. The heavy oak door at the front of the building groaned on its hinges, letting in a sliver of blinding California sunlight. A young man stepped through the threshold. He wasn't tall, but he possessed a certain structural density that made him seem larger than he was. He wore a dark, form-fitting tracksuit, a jarring sight in a room full of white GIs, and thin, flexible shoes designed for traction rather than protection. This was Bruce Lee. He didn't offer a traditional bow to the shrine at the front of the room. He didn't wait to be acknowledged. He walked toward the center of the mat with a step that was deceptively casual, a light, bouncing gait that suggested a coiled spring. The synchronized movement of the 40 students ground to a halt. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of 40 men breathing in unison. Hiroshi turned slowly, his eyes fixing on Bruce with a look of cold, professional curiosity. He asked, in a voice that rumbled from deep in his chest, why a stranger would walk into a house of tradition without an invitation. Bruce didn't stop until he was exactly 6 feet from the sensei. He looked at the rows of students, then back at Hiroshi. He said he hadn't come to disrespect their house, but he had heard they were teaching the way of the empty hand. He wanted to see if that way was a path to actual combat, or merely a way of preserving a ghost. The insult was subtle, but it landed with the weight of a stone. A man named Kenji, Hiroshi's senior-most student and a third-degree black belt, stepped forward. Kenji was the dojo's enforcer, a man whose roundhouse kicks were legendary for their ability to dent heavy bags. He looked at Bruce's relaxed posture, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, his weight shifting almost imperceptibly, and he laughed. He called Bruce a dancer. He said that without the stiff discipline of karate, a man had no foundation. He compared Bruce to a leaf, claiming that while a leaf might be fast, it could never break a rock. Bruce's response was a quiet, almost clinical observation. He told Kenji that the problem with being a rock was that a rock couldn't move once it was thrown. He suggested that their foundation was actually a set of chains. He argued that by the time a karate man chambered his fist at his hip and stepped into a deep stance, a real fighter would have already hit him 3 times. This was the ideological spark that turned a conversation into a confrontation. Hiroshi gave a short, sharp nod. The students immediately moved to the perimeter, their bodies forming a human wall, leaving a 20-foot circle of open floor in the center. Kenji stepped into the circle. He immediately dropped into a Zenkutsudachi, a long, deep front stance. His lead hand was extended in a probing position, and his rear hand was cocked back at his floating ribs, a loaded piston ready to fire. It was a picture of perfect karate form. Bruce, however, refused to mirror him. He stood in what he called the small stance, right foot forward, knees slightly bent, hands held up with the palms open and facing Kenji. He looked vulnerable, his center line seemingly exposed. Kenji moved first. He didn't feint. He didn't believe in them. He used a shuto, knife hand strike aimed at the side of Bruce's neck. It was a blindingly fast move, backed by the full weight of his lunging body. In any other match, Bruce would have had to retreat or execute a hard forearm block. Instead, Bruce did something that defied the dojo's logic. He didn't move away from the strike. He moved into the angle of it. With a movement so economical it was almost invisible, Bruce stepped his lead foot slightly to the right, parrying Kenji's forearm with the palm of his left hand. This was a pak sao, a slapping hand. The sound of the contact was a sharp, wet crack that echoed off the high ceiling. Because Bruce had moved into the blind side of the attack, Kenji's momentum carried his strike harmlessly into the empty air. Before Kenji could retract his arm to reset his stance, Bruce's lead hand, his right hand, flickered. It wasn't a closed fist punch. It was a bilji, a finger jab directed at the space between Kenji's eyes. Bruce didn't follow through. He stopped the tips of his fingers exactly 1 inch from Kenji's corneas. The speed was so absolute that Kenji didn't even have time to blink. He stood frozen, his arm still extended, his heart hammering against his ribs. Bruce stepped back, his face a mask of calm. He told Kenji that his rock was too slow to catch the wind. The students in the circle shifted uncomfortably. They had just seen their champion's best technique countered with a movement that didn't even look like fighting to them. It looked like magic. Kenji was no longer laughing. His face turned a deep, angry red. He realized he was being humiliated in front of his peers. He discarded the formalities of the kata and launched a flurry of strikes. He threw a low-level roundhouse kick aimed at Bruce's lead knee, followed immediately by a reverse punch to the jaw. It was a 1-2 combination, designed to overwhelm the opponent's sensory processing. Bruce's reaction was a masterpiece of JKD, Jeet Kune physics. As Kenji's leg left the floor for the kick, Bruce didn't wait for it to arrive. He executed an intercepting kick. He lifted his lead leg and drove the sole of his shoe directly into Kenji's shin, just as it reached the apex of its arc. It was bone-on-bone contact. Kenji's leg was forced back to the floor. His balance shattered. As Kenji stumbled forward, Bruce entered the trapping range. This was the bridge between long-range striking and grappling. Bruce's hands became a blur of lopsaus, pulling hands, and paksaus. He grabbed Kenji's lead wrist and pulled it downward, while simultaneously slapping Kenji's shoulder, twisting the larger man's torso and pinning his own arms against his chest. For 3 seconds, Kenji was a prisoner of his own anatomy. Every time he tried to pull an arm free, Bruce would use that energy to redirect him. It was like watching a man struggle in a web of invisible wires. Bruce ended the exchange with a short-range back fist to Kenji's temple. Again, he pulled the punch, his knuckles just grazing the skin. Kenji fell back, his breathing ragged. He wasn't injured, but he was exhausted. The mental strain of trying to hit a target that wasn't there was more taxing than any physical workout. He looked at Sensei Hiroshi, a silent plea for guidance in his eyes. He didn't understand why his years of training were failing him. Sensei Hiroshi stepped onto the mat, motioning for Kenji to move to the back of the room. The atmosphere changed instantly. If Kenji was a storm, Hiroshi was a tectonic shift. He didn't use the deep, exaggerated stances of his students. He stood in a more natural, higher stance, his feet shoulder-width apart. He had seen enough to know that Bruce thrived on the opponent's overcommitment. Hiroshi didn't attack immediately. He began to circle Bruce, his eyes locked onto Bruce's center of gravity. He was looking for telegraphs, the small tells that every fighter has before they move. A twitch of the shoulder, a tightening of the jaw, a shift in breathing. But Bruce offered nothing. He remained in a state of dynamic relaxation. His muscles were loose, but his nervous system was at a state of high-voltage readiness. The silence in the dojo was so profound that you could hear the distant sound of traffic on the Oakland streets outside. Hiroshi initiated a feint, a sudden, sharp movement of his head and shoulders meant to draw a reaction. Bruce didn't bite. He stayed perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Hiroshi's chest. Hiroshi lost his patience. He launched a maegeri, a front snap kick directed at Bruce's groin. It was a technical masterpiece, the knee coming up high before the foot flicked out like a whip. Bruce didn't retreat. He used a stop kick, driving his own heel into Hiroshi's hip bone. The collision was audible, a dull, heavy thump. The force of the intercepting kick didn't just stop Hiroshi, it sent a shockwave through his entire skeletal structure. Hiroshi's lead leg went numb for a split second. Most men would have collapsed. Hiroshi, driven by decades of iron body conditioning, simply gritted his teeth and stepped forward into a clinch. He wanted to use his size to crush Bruce, to turn this into a wrestling match where speed would be irrelevant. As Hiroshi reached out to grab Bruce's collar, Bruce transitioned into a series of straight leads. These weren't karate punches. They weren't chambered at the hip. They were fired from the shoulder, using the rotation of the hips and the snap of the lead foot to generate explosive force over a short distance. Thwack, thwack, thwack. 3 punches landed on Hiroshi's chest in the span of a single second. They weren't heavy, pushing punches. They were stinging punches that vibrated through the ribcage. Hiroshi's head snapped back with each impact. He tried to raise his guard, but Bruce's hands were already inside the perimeter. Bruce used a lapsao to catch Hiroshi's lead hand, pulling it down and across the sensei's own body, effectively handcuffing him for a fraction of a second. In that window of opportunity, Bruce unleashed a flurry of chain punches, the Wing Chun heritage modified for maximum impact. Each strike targeted the center line, the nose, the throat, the solar plexus. Hiroshi was being driven backward. His bare feet skidded against the hardwood floor, leaving faint, dark streaks. He tried to throw a desperate uraken back fist, but Bruce simply leaned his head 2 inches to the side, allowing the fist to whistle past his ear. Bruce didn't even look at the punch. His focus was entirely on Hiroshi's core. The fight reached its climax near the far wall, under the watchful eyes of the Okinawan masters in their frames. Bruce landed a double palm strike, the 1-inch mechanic, directly into Hiroshi's sternum. The power didn't come from a long swing. It came from a sudden, violent contraction of the entire body. The sound was like a heavy rug being beaten. Hiroshi hit the wall with enough force to make the building shudder. The photographs of the masters rattled against the wood, and for a moment it seemed as if they might fall. Bruce didn't follow up. He stopped. He was in a perfect, on-guard position, his lead hand flickering like a snake's tongue, his breathing deep and controlled. Hiroshi leaned against the wall, his chest heaving, his face a map of disbelief and growing realization. He looked down at his hands, the hands he had spent 40 years turning into weapons, and he saw that they were useless against a man who refused to be a target. The silence that followed was different from the silence at the beginning. Before, it was the silence of anticipation. Now, it was the silence of a vacuum. The 40 students didn't move. They didn't shout. They looked at their sensei, the man they thought was invincible, and they saw him defeated by a man who hadn't even broken a sweat. Bruce slowly lowered his hands. He didn't boast. He didn't raise his arms in victory. He simply stood there, waiting for the reality of the situation to settle into the room. Hiroshi pushed himself away from the wall. He walked toward the center of the mat, his movement stiff and pained. He stopped 3 feet from Bruce. The students braced themselves, expecting a final, desperate attack. Instead, Hiroshi did something no one expected. He looked Bruce in the eye, and he gave a slow, deep bow. It wasn't the perfunctory bow of a student. It was the bow of a man acknowledging a superior truth. He asked Bruce why he didn't use forms. He asked how it was possible to generate so much power without a stance. Bruce's voice was calm, devoid of the aggressive edge it had earlier. He told Hiroshi that the form is just a finger pointing at the moon. He warned him not to focus on the finger, or he would miss all that heavenly glory. He explained that combat is not a debate. It is a fluid event that requires a fluid response. If you are this way or that way, you are already dead. You must be no way. You must be like water. Water, he explained, can flow or it can crash. It takes the shape of the vessel it is in. It doesn't fight the obstacle, it goes around it, or it wears it away over time. By trying to be hard like a rock, Hiroshi and his students had made themselves brittle. They had traded their natural reflexes for a set of artificial habits. Bruce walked over to the edge of the mat and picked up his thin jacket. He looked around the dojo one last time. He saw the makiwara posts, the heavy bags, the photos of the dead masters. He told the students that they were training to be museum pieces. He suggested that if they wanted to survive a real fight on the streets of Oakland or San Francisco, they had to start training for the chaos, not the choreography. As he walked toward the door, he turned back to Kenji, who was still rubbing his bruised shin. Bruce told him that he wasn't a leaf in the wind. He was the wind itself. The door opened, letting in the late afternoon sun once more, and Bruce Lee disappeared into the golden light. Inside the dojo, the atmosphere had been permanently altered. The kiai shouts that resumed 20 minutes later were hollow, lacking the conviction they had possessed an hour before. Sensei Hiroshi sat on the floor in the corner, watching his students. He didn't correct their stances. He didn't tell them to chamber their fists higher. He just watched them, his mind replaying the image of that straight lead, crossing the distance before he could even think to block. He realized that the way he had followed for 40 years was just one path, and he had just encountered someone who was walking on the horizon. The Oakland encounter wasn't just a fight, it was a demolition of an era. It was the moment the martial arts world was forced to realize that tradition is a wonderful teacher, but a terrible master. The story of what happened in that dojo would spread through the Bay Area like a wildfire, growing with every telling. But the core of the story remained the same. A young man had walked into a house of stone, and using nothing but the physics of motion and a mind free of clutter, he had shown them that the stone was actually made of sand. From that day forward, the students at the Oakland dojo began to look at their katas differently. They began to experiment with their stances. They began to ask why instead of just how. And in the quiet moments of the evening, when the floorboards were still warm from the day's training, they would stand in the center of the mat and try to find that no stance, the posture of a man who was ready for everything because he was attached to nothing. Bruce Lee had left the building, but the water he had poured into that vessel was still swirling, slowly and inevitably changing the shape of everything it touched.